Good morning. It is good to see everybody. It is good to be here. I know I've said it already, but it's worth saying again. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers. Always grateful that we can be with you as often as we can. We're going to continue the sermon series I've been working on for this month, but we're going to take a little different turn with the idea. We're going to be focusing on a book of the Old Testament that I'm sure you're very familiar with. As I think about mothers and mothering and grandmothers and this whole idea of what it means, and focusing on our relationship with God and how incredibly important it is to lead our children and our grandchildren in a path of righteousness. I think about the book of Ruth. And so I hope that is a study that you have thought about recently, or maybe you've read through that if you're doing your yearly Bible reading, and it really struck you as a powerful message, because it is. It is a powerful message that God provides for us about a woman who leads a foreigner to God. And I hope that helps you this morning. So I want to start by asking a few questions. I was thinking through different ideas and questions that I may want to ask and follow up on towards the end of this study. But my first question is this: who led you to Jesus? I want you to just kind of think about that for a minute. Who introduced you to Jesus? Who led you to Jesus? Was it a parent? Was it a grandparent, a friend, a family member? Just kind of think about that for a little bit and kind of contemplate that relationship and who led you to Jesus. But as a parent and as a grandparent, the question I would ask is, are you leading in this present world, in this current reality? Are you leading someone to Jesus? In other words, are you purposely, actively pursuing opportunity to lead someone to Jesus? Who's following in your footsteps? Where are you leading them? Are we setting an example for those who are following us and leading them in a direction that is wholesome and righteous and godly? Or is that what we are doing with our life? Are we leading people? Because ultimately we may not acknowledge at times, I don't know if anybody's following me or not. I'm living my life and I'm not really paying a lot of attention, but somebody's watching you. Somebody is looking at you. Somebody is watching your life and leading you in some direction. And the question is, where are you leading them? Or maybe as a daughter or a son or a grandson or a granddaughter, right? We might ask the question, are you following, right? Are you clinging to someone who is leading you to Jesus? Are you following? Are you actively pursuing? Because it goes both sides. It goes both ways, doesn't it? We have to acknowledge that even in our youth, we have to actively pursue and follow those who we believe will lead us to Jesus. So I hope those questions will be helpful as we look through this book. We're going to, I'm going to turn on my remote, and then it will work. There you go. Look at that. Funny how that is. So Ruth chapter 1, we're going to start in verses 1 and 9. We're going to pick up on the storyline, and then we're going to work our way through the text. So the story of Ruth. The story of Ruth takes place during a really dark time in Israel's history. There's a famine in the land. There's a lot of difficulty that's going on. And in fact, verse 1 says, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed, that there was a famine in the land, and a current man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons." Now, the irony of that is Bethlehem the word means bread basket, place of bread, but there's no bread. There's a famine in the land. You can read through the Judges and kind of probably pick up on why there would be a famine in the land, but nonetheless, that's the situation that takes place. And it seems that the family is acting unfaithful. And the reason I say that is because instead of staying in the land where they belong and waiting for God for whatever He's going to do, they are going to try to find for themselves food outside of the land. So they go to the land of the Moabites. They go seeking food. So it seems that they are being unfaithful. They're not trusting in God's provision, but they're being impatient, so they leave. And then it says, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And she was left with 2 sons, and they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. And the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there for about 10 years. And then Mahlon and Chilion also died. Those were the men. And the women were bereft of their 2 children and her husband. So all the males in the family have perished. They've died. And so there's no male leadership in this family. And this woman is left with these foreign daughter-in-laws. You know, you can kind of imagine the situation that she is in. How is she going to accomplish this? Obviously, the plot from going from a place of famine, you know, that was bad enough. But now it has thickened as they have left the land. In essence, it's kind of symbolizing leaving God's provision. And now they're outside of the land of promise. They're outside of Bethlehem in a foreign land. Their sons have taken foreign wives, but they have perished. The husband has died from unknown reasons. And now she's left with these foreign women. She doesn't know what to do. In her mind, she's going to think, well, I can't really take them back to Bethlehem, although that's the most logical thing for her to do is to go back home. They're not going to be welcome there. It's not going to be a good situation for them. So we see the situation becoming very dire for these women. How are they going to survive? Right? And so continuing on, as we read through the story, we learn that she does make it back to Bethlehem. We'll talk a little bit about that, but she goes with a different name. You remember her first name was Naomi, which means sweet, and she's going to actually change her name to Mara, which means bitter, to kind of symbolize her circumstances at the loss of her husband and her son. So verse 8 says, and Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go return each to your mother's house. In other words, a lot of times we hear the father's house. That's a lot of times what we hear about, especially in the Jewish culture. But in this case, it's the mother's house. And what she is saying, in essence, is that she cannot be their mother the way she needs to be. She cannot serve that purpose. She cannot fulfill their needs. They need to go back home. They need to go start over again. They need to go find other husbands since theirs have perished. But continuing on, it says, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest each in the house of her husband. And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices, and they wept. So as the story continues, if you look at verse 14, it says, and they lifted up their voices, they wept, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she has an opportunity to go back to her mother's house. In other words, it's kind of a start over, a do-over, if you will, to where they're going to have an opportunity to find other husbands and raise a family in their land with their people and whatnot. And one of these daughter-in-laws is going to say, you know, I'm going to take that opportunity. I'm going to go back. But then we have Ruth, who makes a different decision. Instead of going back, she's going to cling to her mother-in-law. She's going to stay with her mother-in-law instead of going back to her blood relatives, going back to her family's gods, going back to the Moabites, going back to that culture, finding a Moabite husband to marry. She's going to make a choice to stay with her Jewish mother-in-law and to serve her God and to seek out his provision in this relationship. Look at verse 15. It says, and then she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. In other words, she just doesn't see a future for this young lady. She feels like this is the right move. You need to go back home. You need to go back where your family is. She just doesn't see how it's going to work out well for her daughter-in-law that she would follow her back to Bethlehem. But Ruth's response signifies an incredible amount of loyalty. But not just that. I want you to think about what else it signifies. Ruth's response is going to tell us what kind of influence Naomi has had on on Ruth? What kind of impact Naomi has had on her life? What message was presented to her? What life was lived? What was presented in the form of life and word and deed? And we're going to see that from Ruth's words in verse 16. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." Now, of course, as we read those words, we think, yes, as a Christian parent, as a grandparent, we think this is what I want right here. This is what I want for my children. This is what I want for my children's children. This is what I want for my grandchildren. This is what I want. I want them to say these words. I want them to have this mindset. I want them to think, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to cling to you. And I'm going to allow you to lead me to your God and your Lord. That's what we want as Christian parents for our kids. And that's what we hope that our kids will follow through with. Look at verse 18. He says, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. In other words, Ruth is so determined that she is going to go with her mother-in-law that Naomi just gives up. She's like, well, I don't know what else to do. I can't send you home. I can't leave you by yourself. So they make the journey back to Bethlehem. Now, starting in verse 2 and verse 1, chapter 2, verse 1, says, Naomi had a kinsman to her husband, a man of great wealth, a family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And throughout the story, this is the first time we see good news, okay? Right? Up to this point, it's just been, I don't know, it's a desperate situation. The men in the family have died. These women are having to make some hard choices. It's sad. It's difficult. This is good news in the story that finally there is somebody in this story who can actually become a savior of this family, a redeemer of the family. The good news. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 21, it talks about how God intended for the poor and the foreigner to be cared for. Jewish people didn't always do that, but God had made provisions within the law for people who were in need. And in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 21, it says, when they gather the grapes of the vineyard, you shall not go over it again. In other words, don't strip the whole vineyard. Right? Go through, and if there's some left over, you leave it. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow. And so God has already made provision through the law that when his people do the harvesting, that they would leave some behind. That they wouldn't go back and try to make extra profit by gleaning the remaining amount that was left. That they would make sure to leave behind some so that the alien would have food, the orphan would have food, the widow would have something to eat, something to nourish their bodies. Look at verse 3. It says, so she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come into the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the family of Elimelech. So one of the unique features of the book is God's divine providence, and why it's unique. It's not uncommon and it's not unheard of, except for in this particular story, it's not presented like that. It's not shown. It doesn't say, and then God led her to, or God did this, or God actively pursued. None of that is in this book. It is a story from a perspective of somebody who is watching from the outside and looking at the events taking place. Now, we certainly can see God's activity, God's work, God's providence at play. But what's unique about this story is it doesn't present it that way, which is very helpful to us because sometimes there are things in our life that we can accredit to God's providence, leading us to a certain person being led to us, and the ability and the opportunities to teach people and lead them to Jesus. Those opportunities come and we recognize them as God's providence, but our narrator doesn't tell us it was. We just know it is. And so that seems to be a unique feature of the book. So looking on, we're going to move to chapter 3. It says in chapter 3, after she comes back and she tells her mom about what she experienced in chapter 3, it says, "Wash yourself, therefore, anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man," talking about Boaz, "until he has finished eating and drinking." So a widow would often be in plain clothing. This would be an indication that she was a widow, indicating that she was a widow, was sending a message, a mourning of her husband. But what Naomi is telling her, that she needs to change her clothes. She needs to make it known that she is now an available woman, that she has been bereft of her husband, that she's a widow, but the time of mourning has passed. She's going to change her clothing. She's going to wash, which is just a sense of purification and anointing of oils and things of that nature. And she's going to make it known that she is ready and able to marry. So in verse 4, it says, "It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down, when he will tell you what you shall do." And then she said to her, "All that you say, I will do." So I don't know, there's a lot of questions about the reason for this procedure, exactly what was going on here. But whatever the situation is, Naomi believed that when Boaz saw her and realized what she was doing, that he would acknowledge that this woman is submitting herself to the family and to him as the family redeemer. That seemed to be the message that Naomi knew would be communicated by this act. However it may be, we're kind of lost in history as to what all this implies, but we know that that's the message that's being communicated. And Boaz would go forward and say, "Okay, this is what you need to do. This is what needs to come next. This is the rest of your story." And she does that. And she does exactly what she's told. But there's another twist in the story, because we find out from that encounter that there is another family redeemer, that there's one that's even closer in relation to the family. And that person has to basically give up their rights as a redeemer so that Boaz can continue and move forward with this relationship. So look what it says in chapter 4. "So I thought to inform you to say by it before those who are sitting here." So he calls in this elder council, and he's going to bring in the man who is closer in relation to the family, and he's going to communicate this with them. So he goes and he finds them, and he finds the elders, and he brings them all together in this little council. And he says, "And before the elders of the people, if you will redeem it," in other words, redeem Elimelech's family, "if you will redeem that right, redeem it, but if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you." And this is kind of the twist of the story. The man, not Boaz, but the other man says, "I will. I'll redeem it." Because what he's going to receive is everything Elimelech ever owned. His land, his house, his family, right? All the rights, the birthrights, everything. And so he's thinking, I have a right, God-given right to redeem this. I will redeem it. I will redeem whatever was his. But then, look what happens next. Verse 5. "Then Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth, the Moabitess." So that's kind of he waits to, present that portion of it. So at first he's thinking, yes, that's what I need to do. I need to go ahead and redeem this. I'm the rightful heir of all these things. I will take those possessions and I will make Naomi a part of my family, and whoever is with her will be part of my family. But then Boaz says, yes, but there is Ruth. And she is a Moabitess, and you'll have to take her too. And so you can imagine the plot twist here as you think about this man. Is he going to take a foreign woman into his home? Is that really what he wants to do? Is that going to jeopardize anything in regards to his relationship with the people? And so the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased in his inheritance. So look at verse 6. It says, the closest relative, this is the other man, not Boaz, just to be straight, says, I cannot redeem it for myself. Okay? So at first he says, I will, but now with this new information, he says, okay, I cannot do that. I cannot follow through with this because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. And then he says, redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. Now, later the council of witnesses will recognize the union between Boaz and Ruth, and a blessing on the family will be bestowed. So we kind of imagine the scenario, and we can imagine all of these coming into play and this relationship that is about to take place. Boaz wants to redeem. He would be honored to have Ruth as part of his family, a foreigner, somebody who was outside the covenant of God, who would now become part of the covenant of God through marriage. He would love to be able to do that, but he has to have the blessing of the one who is closer in relation, which he gets, because that one forfeits his redemption. He says, no, I will not take that upon myself, because somehow he feels that it's going to jeopardize his own inheritance. I don't know how he believes that or why it would, but for some reason he believes it would. And so he encourages Boaz to go ahead and move forward with this relationship, right? And so this is the one time in the story where the phrase Ruth the Moabitess becomes a positive thing. Because up to this point, it was a negative thing. It's been a problem all along. Even Naomi wasn't sure how it was going to work out. It was going to create problems for everybody. To bring a foreigner into the land is going to create problems with all the relationships. But this is the only time in the story where being a Gentile is going to be a blessing. Being a foreigner is going to be a blessing. Because now she will be redeemed by Boaz, who has a desire to redeem her. And so Boaz was the closest, redeems her. The family begins to have a positive spin. But I want you to look at verse 11 rather. It says, all the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. I want you to listen to what they say. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah. Do you remember Rachel and Leah, right? I mean, they're the ones who bring about the whole tribe of Israel, but we can think about their relationship and how that all worked. But then he also says, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. What a blessing, right? I mean, this is how they view the situation, that this is an incredible blessing for Boaz and will be for his family. Look at verse 12. He says, moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. So the one man was afraid. He was afraid of his reputation. He was afraid this was going to damage his inheritance, and he would not redeem this woman. But Boaz does. He takes them in as his own, going through this process, and he receives this incredible blessing from the elders. He receives this incredible blessing from the people, one that you would anticipate any Jew to desire. This kind of blessing, this kind of relationship. So let's look at verse 13. It says, so Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in all of Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life, a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than even 7 sons, has given birth to him. So the women of Israel are looking at Naomi, and they are saying, your daughter-in-law has become a blessing to you. Now, remember, Gentile daughter-in-law has become a blessing to you. More than 7 sons. And to have a son, of course, was a great blessing for Israel and for the people. But more than 7 sons, she would be more than a blessing to you. But look at verse 18. It says, now these are the generations of Perez. Now this is why this story is so important for the Christian, right? Because here's the storyline. Here's the family line. From Perez was born Hezron. From Hezron was born Ram. From Ram was born Amminadab. And from Amminadab was born Nahshon, and from Nahshon, Solomon, and from Solomon, Boaz, and Boaz, Obed, and Obed, Jesse, and from Jesse, guess who? David. And we all know who comes through the line of David. We ultimately see Jesus. So this is an incredible story because it paints the picture of our life as Gentiles through the Jewish Redeemer. Through the Jewish Redeemer, the outsider, those outside the covenant of God are being brought in, but not just brought in, right? Because we can think about many times when Gentiles are brought into the covenant, not just brought in as an alien or a sojourner or an outsider, but brought in as family, blessed, part of the family, full inheritance, as if we were born into the family of God, that the relationship through the Redeemer means that we have a relationship with God which could not have taken place if a Jew had not redeemed us into the family of God. So this loyalty that comes from Ruth, but an incredible influence that Naomi had on her ultimately brings a blessing to both Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and us as we see the story moving forward. So an application, kind of thinking through this story and thinking through the different things that it means to us in the midst of a very dark time in Israel, a very dark time in Israel, as a people did whatever was right in their own eyes. You can read that from Judges 21, verse 25. That's how the people were functioning. In the midst of all of this, God, through a very dire and hopeless situation. Remember, the situation was hopeless. They left the land. All of the men in the family died. These foreign women had to make a choice whether they're going to go back to their own gods and their own family, or whether they're going to follow Naomi back to Bethlehem in hopes that they will find a home there. That dire situation, God has taken that and he has made it into a beautiful story of redemption. That he has redeemed this family and brought them closer together. But this is our story, isn't it? I mean, it's our story. Because not a single person in this room could ever claim the birthright of Israel. Right? We don't have that. We were all born on this side of the covenant. We could never acknowledge a birthright of Israel. We can never say, my father was Abraham and therefore I have a right to the blessing. Nobody here can say that. How can we as outsiders ever have that relationship with God? How could we as outsiders receive the blessing that was promised to the people of God? It's through that story. It's through Ruth. It's through a Gentile who was brought into the family, who was redeemed by the kinsman redeemer, to the point where we, through Jesus, our kinsman redeemer, can be adopted into the family of God. And as Gentiles, we can become part of the blessed family, sons of God, receiving the inheritance of God. Right? We don't have to glean from the fields as if we're aliens. We don't have to go out and try to harvest what was left over by the covenant people of God. We get to sit at the table of God and feast on the banquet of God that he provides only for his people because of our kinsman redeemer Jesus, who has brought us into the family of God, so that through the seed of woman we may have the blessing of redemption through Jesus. Now, there's a couple of takeaways that I want you to have from this lesson. The first are those who've already mentioned. I just want to repeat those things to you and let you think about them. As parents, as grandparents, are we leading our family to Jesus, the kinsman redeemer? Is that what we're doing? Actively, not by accident, but purposely. Are we encouraging them to lay their lives at the feet of Jesus? Like we have? Is that our encouragement for them? And also as daughter, son, grandson, granddaughter, are we clinging to somebody? Are we purposely seeking out people who would lead us to the kinsman redeemer, Jesus? Are we clinging to somebody and following them to Jesus? And so I want to finish off with this last thought. To whom do you say, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. If there's anybody here this morning who needs the prayers of this congregation, we're available for you. Let us pray for you and encourage you in any way that we can. Maybe you desire to become part of the family of God through baptism. That opportunity is available to you. Follow the Kingsman Redeemer. Allow him to redeem you, to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins. Whatever your need may be, if you would come forward as we stand and as we sing.